His view is that, and I quote, "Even though it is possible to advance both democracy and globalization, this requires the creation of a global political community that is vastly more ambitious than anything we have seen to date or are likely to experience soon. Democratic global governance of this sort is a chimera," close quote. His suggestion is that as long as sovereign nation states exist, especially democratic ones, economic globalization is more likely to be in tension with the concept of self-determination. This helps us understand what is happening in Europe today. In the final analysis, Europe's economic integration has without doubt moved too quickly ahead of its political integration. Left in this form, the solutions to the European sovereign debt crisis face a challenge of having to balance the existence of Greece as a democracy and the European Union's ability to implement and control measures to pull the country out of its debt problems. The same is true for several other countries in Europe faced with very tough reform regimes. This is the difficult challenge facing Europe and other organizations such as the G20 as they stand ready to support Europe in appropriate ways going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem facing the sovereignty of states and their impact on the globalized economy no doubt carries wide-ranging implications for the response to the global economic crisis. This situation is exemplified by the loss of coordination and commitment to the process agreed to at the London summit of the G20 held in April 2009, following the 2008 meeting in Washington to respond to the crisis. As you would recall, the London summit declaration made huge progress in addressing the crisis in several ways. It strengthened the capacity of the IMF to respond to the crisis, while at the same time setting into motion an important reform of the governance structures of the IMF. In addition, it made important progress in getting international agreement on reforms of the regulatory environment in the financial sector. In this way, the summit managed to address both short-term and longer-term causes of the crisis simultaneously. And yet, since London, the G20 seems to have lost some of its force as a unified response to global problems. In its current form, the G20 epitomizes the absence of a global political community that we described in the context of Greece in the European Union. In essence, the G20 exists as a premier forum for international economic cooperation, but it is not, to all intents and purposes, a global political system. While we have the United Nations as an outstanding international representative institution for addressing conflict and development challenges worldwide, it has not yet become a global government that can address the tensions of economic globalization effectively. Some of these non-core activities that have arisen out of the G20 processes have led to valuable developments in cushioning some of the effects of the crisis. We are pleased, for example, at the outcome of the Development Working Group, which has made commitments on infrastructure development, agricultural development, commodity price stabilization, and support for taxation systems in developing countries, which are likely to prove very valuable for our continent in Africa. The importance of the Development Working Group of the G20 goes beyond enabling the long-term sustainable growth of the world economy. It is also key in helping to legitimize its existence amongst the non-members of the G20, most of which are developing countries. The G20 has also made progress in other areas since London. It has, for example, established mutual accountability, committing countries to report key economic indicators and policies to each other, which is a step forward towards greater international economic cooperation. Thus, for a relatively small country like ourselves, South Africa, trying to engage effectively in all aspects of G20 activity has become more complex, especially as we carry the view of the whole continent of Africa. For this reason, the task of focusing on core issues in the G20 has been compromised by the size and complexity of the G20 agenda. To address this challenge, a decision has been taken to strengthen the role of the G20 Troika, which we hope will streamline oversight of the agenda. While the G20 is an imperfect institution, it is needed more than ever given the absence of a global economic governance body to manage the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the key players in the world economy is China, as we all know. Like other large developing countries, China has been extraordinarily important to the world economy in recent years. Its contribution to world growth has been greater than any other country in recent history. China's growth is therefore very meaningful for Africa, as it has become an indispensable element of improved growth in Africa over the past decade. Be that as it may, Africa needs to find ways to encourage partners like China and India to become much more involved in the development of value-adding production and services within the continent. Africa needs to build capacity in infrastructure and human resources and to continue to improve competitiveness. Some African countries have already engaged with China to persuade the Chinese to help in the establishment of manufacturing industries in Africa, and in this regard, a number of projects have been started. Africa should not be afraid to use its bargaining power, as it has the largest access to resources such as minerals, oil, and fertile agricultural land. This then raises questions about our own relation to foreign investments in our own country. As we have noted before, South African Competition Authority need to prevent the abuse of market power and must encourage economic integration with the rest of the world to support competition. The unintended consequences of a less nuanced application of competition laws has left many South African companies vulnerable to takeovers by foreign companies. Measures and acquisitions of South African companies should be favorably considered to the extent that they improve our capital base and capacity to play competitively in the global market. Government's approach must therefore actively encourage the creation of new firms and expansion of existing firms that leads to the growth of local industries, enabling them to play in the global market. Foreign direct investment in South Africa must be long-term in its outlook, encouraged by our progressive state policies to support growth in the market and the strategic direction of investment in labor-intensive production. Program Director, the challenges posed by the current global economic environment on the developmental state are many and require clear and appropriate policy responses, especially for developing countries. As we noted at the start of the financial crisis in 2008, the opportunities for development out of this crisis lie in increased public investment in economic infrastructure, introducing effective industrial or sector strategies, and ensuring higher levels of private sector investment and entrepreneurship, pursuing the transformation of the informal economy activities and its integration into the formal economy, improving and streamlining government delivery and regulation, improving economic efficiency, and committing to macroeconomic policies that support decent work and sustainable growth. In this regard, this is finding renewed impetus through the National Development Plan published by the National Planning Commission. The plan has committed, amongst other things, to government-driven investment in infrastructure and the deepening of the industrial strategy as outlined in the new growth path and the Industrial Policy Action Plan 2. These critical areas will require support from business leaders such as yourselves to ensure its success. Government cannot achieve these ideals without your help and participation, and we hope that working together we can do more to achieve a better life for all South Africans. And I thank you for your attention.
Would you like to stay here for the question?
I'll stay here.
I'll take the copy. Right.